Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to FunAhead TV. Today, we are continuing work on my 2001 Porsche 996 Carrera 4, actually really beginning the engine rebuild process. So if you missed the last episode, please go back and watch it. Basically, I started out by introducing this project, and then we began by taking the engine out of this car, which, as you can see, engine and transmission are still together, sitting right here. But just as a quick recap for those of you who didn't see it, the whole gist of this project, the whole goal of this project, is to make the most bulletproof M96 engine on the planet. How are we going to do that, you ask? Well, just wait, because I will go into some detail, quite a bit of detail actually, about how exactly we're going to do that in this very episode. Now, I realize I look like a Backstreet Boy wearing this hat. Who needs that hat? So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to start out by getting all the auxiliaries off of this engine. First, of course, we need to get the transmission off. Then we need to get the engine up on a stand. Then we can begin by taking all the auxiliary stuff off. If we have time today, which I think we will get the valve covers off, pull the cams, take a look at the whole valve train, see how that's looking. I think that's about as far as we're going to get today, but we will be able to do some parts analysis. What I'm very curious to see is the condition of the timing chain guides. If you've been viewing my channel for a while, you'll know that a couple years ago, we did the timing chain guides in this engine. All of the timing chain guides, with the exception of the intermediate shaft chain tensioning guide and actual guide. And of course, if you know these engines, you know that you can't actually get to that chain and guide unless you actually split the case. So that's one of the things we're going to be doing, of course, in the process of this entire engine rebuild. But one of the main things I want to touch on in this episode today is talking about all of the weak points of the M96 engine. Yes, all of them. So I'm going to break all those down, and then we're going to go over exactly what it is we're going to be doing on this engine to then counteract every single one of those gotcha things with the M96. Alrighty, now, before we start ripping and tearing into this engine, I do just want to take a couple quick minutes to give some context. So the engine in my car is of the M96 generation of engines, which is closely related to the M97 generation of engines that came shortly after it. Basically, the M96 generation of engines is the very first water-cooled generation of engines that followed the long-running and very infamous air-cooled engines that Porsche was known for. So, needless to say, that engine had some seriously huge shoes to fill. Increasing emissions regulations were finally what forced Porsche to have to move away from the air-cooled engine. As some background to vehicle development, meeting emissions regulations is one of the most expensive aspects of any given car's development. That, coupled with a long time running financial hardship within the Porsche brand, led to an entirely new approach to development and manufacturing, thanks to some serious coaching from a very small firm of former Toyota employees that helped Porsche get their act together. And as a result, the 986 Boxster and 996 911 were born. And these two vehicles were the very first ones to ever tout the M96 engine. So being that A, this was an entirely new generation of engine, and B, it was developed with cost cutting in mind, inherently there were some weak points that would be found over the years. That being said, they are still a great engine, regardless of what a lot of people on forums will tell you. It's also worth noting that the old air-cooled 911 engines did have their fair share of problems as well. Every engine has their problems. With that, let's go over all of the potential issues that an M96, M97 engine can have, internal issues that is. Then we'll go on to talking about the solutions to these problems and exactly how we're going to implement those solutions to my vehicle to make this thing the most reliable M96 engine in the world. Just a note, not all these issues are particularly common. So if you have a car that has an M96 or M97 engine, I am by no means trying to be like one of those fear mongers out there and freak you out about your car. Your car is probably perfectly fine, and most importantly, it gives you context for everything we're doing in this video series. So with that, let's get into it. Also, I have it categorized by just general everyday use issue and issues that are mostly exaggerated by track usage. First of all, IMS bearing problems. That is the biggest, number one problem that everyone thinks of when they think of this generation of Porsches. There are several causes to this. We're not going to get into that because we could talk about IMS bearing failure ad nauseum. Basically, just know that is a potential problem with these engines. Next thing, cylinder failure. The primary form of cylinder failure is bore scoring. A lot of people talk about this these days, and it is an issue that has been creeping up more and more on cars, primarily on the 3.4 liter, 3.6 liter, and 3.8 liter cars. Anyway, again, that's another issue that you could talk about ad nauseum and has been debated heavily on forums. Next one, failed or ticking lifters. We've talked about that with the Boxster before. Basically, the hydraulic lifters in the engine can fail after a while, and then you get a ticking sound. It's not the end of the world, but it can cause misfires, and it does eventually need to be resolved. Next item, aging or failing timing chain guides. This is something that is just kind of inevitable that we've talked about many times on the channel. Name of the game, aging rubbers and plastics on older cars. And unfortunately, timing chain guides are solidly underneath that umbrella of aging plastics and rubbers. Next thing, connecting rod bearing failure. This, in my opinion, is primarily due to the very extended oil change intervals that Porsche prescribed in the early and mid 2000s. The ones that can be accelerated by track use are, well, of course, I did, as you can see in the table, categorize rod bearing failure under that. Well, because you're putting a lot of strain on your rod bearings when you're on track. And in the case of the M96, M87 rod bearings, they were kind of undersized, so extensive track usage can cause these to wear more quickly. Next thing, connecting rod bolt stretching. If you talk to any of the Porsche M96, M97 engine rebuilders, they will all tell you, yeah, this is a pretty common issue with extensive track usage. Next thing, oil starvation. The stock sumps in these cars were known to be somewhat insufficient, and by somewhat, I mean quite a bit. So if you do run your car on track, make sure to get a deeper sump with the better baffle. And lastly, overheating. And I think this is primarily a thing with the 996.1 generation cars. Being that this was the first water-cooled 911 generation, I think they just didn't know how much water cooling they would need, and they underspec'd the grill opening going to the two radiators on the front end. Alrighty, well, I hope that little bit of background info on the M96 and all of its problems helped to kind of give you some context on the entire project. But later in the video, we'll talk about every single item that we're going to be doing to countermeasure each of the issues that the M96 can possibly have. So for now, let's get tearing into this thing and make some progress towards making this the most reliable M96 engine in the world. Well, if you've never done this, it's actually very simple to remove the transmission from the engine. It is a series of 16mm bolts up and around the top here, with the exception of 2 bolts. One of which is right there. That's a 15mm, and it has a nut on the back side. And then this is a 10mm triple square on the lower left side here. Other than that, very self-explanatory bolt pattern, but they do have differing lengths, and for that reason, I like to do this. I always make one of these poorly drawn picture of what the transmission bell housing looks like. That way I can put all of the bolts in the place of my little template here and be able to keep track of which bolts go where. So let's go ahead and do it. All right, well, there's the transmission as you saw. Pretty easy peasy. I legit think that job took like 5 minutes tops. Just takes a little bit of bare wrestling and, you know, like I said, a little bit of organization. Now we need to move on to getting the engine onto the stand. But getting it up on the stand is going to involve our friend John Deere over there. So let's get him fired up. Well, it is time to get to ripping and a tearing. I went ahead and drained the oil off camera because, quite honestly, that's about as exciting as watching an ostrich take a nap. Now it's just time to go ahead and take the exhaust off. From there, we can just start chugging on all the auxiliaries. So let's do it. Well, boom frickin' shakalaka. As we do laps around the engine, you can see that we have all the stuff off the top of the engine. It is now time to zip zap that water pump off there. Thermostat's coming off. We will get the coil pack spark plugs out of there, and then we will take the cam covers off. We're starting there as opposed to taking the oil pump off first because, as you probably well know, the oil pump holds one of the two sides of the intermediate shaft. We are going to need to put each bank into their respective top dead center so that we can nice and easily take the cams out. And of course, things start getting bound up when you don't have that side of the intermediate shaft held and you're trying to rotate the timing chains. But check it out. Last time I had the intake plenums off was a couple years ago when I did the timing chain guides. At that time, I did a very thorough job, at least I think it was a thorough job, of decarboning the intake ports. They were pretty badly caked up just from 20 plus years of mileage and use. And check it out, they still look like I just cleaned those puppies. I mean, there is no carbon put back on them whatsoever. Look at that. The other side's the same way. Well, ladies and gents, we have the bank one cylinder head perfectly taken down. As much as I really, really want to, and we can see the head bolts, and all we need to do is loosen those puppies up, we are going to take down bank two. We're just gonna go ahead and have both banks in the same status, then we'll take the heads off. Also, just a quick note, oops, I just ripped my glove. Sweet, that's awesome. I did go ahead and turn the engine 360 degrees. So we now have it in the bank two cylinder head, top dead center orientation. Let me show you really quickly how you can tell if the engine is in a respective bank's top dead center. So when you look on the side that has the scavenging oil pump, for bank two, you look at the intake cam and you look for the notch right here. And you can see that this notch on the intake cam is pointed inwards, which means that it is near bank two's top dead center. And to put it in truly bank two top dead center, this has to be pointing in, and then the crank has to be on crank top dead center. And you tell that by looking at the 0T notated hole in the crank pulley and making sure that that is lined up with this. And then you can put your key in there to ensure that it is in fact in crank top dead center. So bank two, notch has to point in, crank locked in 0T. Bank one is the opposite. The notch has to point outward for its top dead center. That's what I mean when I say I turn the engine 360 degrees, because originally I had the notch for the bank one cam pointing outwards, which this one was too. And so then you have to turn the crank 360 degrees to get this notch to turn 180 degrees because the cams spin at half the speed of the crank. Lock it in top dead center. Ensure that that is pointed inwards. Cool, we are in bank two top dead center. All right, good? Everyone good? All right, well, as you saw, we have officially all of the stuff off of the front end of the engine. Sorry. Also, while we're in this area, got some front main seal weepage going on. It's not dripping, but it's weeping. Let's, for a second, go in the back and take a look at the parts that just came out of these two cylinder heads. Okay, so I've got everything laid out on my bench here. On the left here, we have bank one. On the right here, we have bank two. Just want to take a quick second to do some, kind of wear analysis. Right off the bat, the timing chain guides. What's interesting is, so like I said, these are 2 years old. The guides look perfect. The tensioning guides on both banks actually does have some wear. You can see on this upper edge a little bit of wear, and then on the leading edge of it also a little bit of wear. I mean, not terrible at all. I mean, that's not chunking material into the oil. It has worn some little gouges into them, which is surprising to me because these are effectively brand new parts. Same thing on the bank 2. Idler guide itself has no wear, no noticeable wear. Whereas the tensioning guide, yep, there's some score marks in that thing. Only on the top on this one, though. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and replace those, just because we've got them out. And I bought them on FCP Euro a couple of years back, and they all have lifetime part warranties. The other timing chain guides that we replaced a couple years back were these guide pads right here. These, I mean, from what I can tell, these do seem to be in pretty good shape. You do need a special tool to compress the variocam solenoid. You're supposed to do that when you remove the cams, but honestly, you really don't need to. It makes installation a lot easier, and it is essential for if you want to take the variocam solenoid out. What we are actually going to do is replace all of the timing chains. I didn't do that 2 years ago when I had all these things apart. So yeah, from what I can tell though, you can kind of scoot it over a little bit, and you can see, you know, you can tell where the chain's been running, but it's probably impossible to tell on camera. In fact, it's very hard to tell like with the naked eye. I can't even feel a gouge in there. Nothing's chunking apart, and they did change the material from the original material that this car had for these pads to what this is. That old material was more like this brown material here. So anyway, that's timing chain guides. Definitely something to watch out for in your car if you have an older M96, M97 engine. Check your oil filter when you do a oil change, and you will see most likely little bits of brown timing chain guide if your guides are failing. Next thing is lifters. A lot of people talk about this. They get it confused with bore scoring, which we'll talk about more later. Lifters can fail. These are hydraulic lifters. Get oil from the engine, oil pressure through that hole right there, and those adjust over time as, you know, your valve train wears and inherently needs to take up a little bit of slack. If you have a collapsed one of these, it can cause a ticking sound, and a pretty loud one at that, and a lot of people get that confused with the bore scoring sound, which is also a ticking sound. Fortunately, in the case of this engine, I checked all of these as I took them out. None of them are collapsed, which is nice. The downside is I'm still going to replace all of them because they're out, and again, for the sake of making the most robust engine out there and refreshing everything, we're just going to go ahead and replace all of those. And those are original, so we might as well just do them because I would be kicking myself pretty freaking hard if we put all these back up in there and one of them started ticking at some point. Okay, so that's about it with regards to the parts that are directly under the cam covers on these engines. Well, now that we've begun tearing down the engine somewhat, I just want to finish out this video by talking about the things that we're going to be doing to my vehicle specifically that are the solutions for every single M96, M97 known issue, so that we can then make the most reliable M96 in the world. Now, going back to our list, IMS bearing failure. Now, I did go ahead and replace the intermediate shaft bearing several years back with the Ellen Engineering IMS retrofit bearing. This basically upgrades you from a single row to a dual row bearing, and it's known to be just a better bearing in general. Now, of course, these do have a service life, but I am going to continue running this bearing as it only has 20,000-ish miles on it. It's got a lot of life left to go, and they're very easy to replace. So someday we'll put a new one in it, but for now, we're going to continue running it. Now, the second part of that makes it very robust is pinning the IMS shaft. This is the driven pulley on the IMS shaft. Basically, what can happen is the driven pulley will have what's called run out, where the pulley, which is only pressed onto the shaft, begins to get off axis and can effectively be wobbling as it's spinning. This, of course, causes your intermediate shaft bearing to be flexed as that shaft is spinning, and then eventually your bearing will fail. And this is a very uncommon issue. You never know with extensive track usage, all that heat, all that stress, etc., things can happen, and I figured I'm going to go ahead and just have that driven pulley pinned so that it can't possibly happen. For the next item, cylinder problems. Now, whether my car has bore scoring or not, it doesn't matter. My concern is that it's a high enough mileage car, and with extensive track usage, the iron cladding coating on my pistons will inevitably fail, as it does with a lot, almost every, basically 3.4 liter, 3.6, and 3.8 liter, which will then lead to bore scoring. What we're going to do is have this engine block completely re-sleeved with Nikasil cylinder liners. I'm not going to tell you quite yet who's doing that, but we'll talk about that in a future video. Additionally, we're having completely new pistons put in it as well. Anyway, that's going to be the solution to bore scoring with regards to my car. Next up, failed/ticking lifters. Well, we're just going to go ahead and replace all the lifters to be brand new. There's not really improved ones out there, but I'm just going to go with brand new OEM ones so that we can have reset 0 mileage lifters to avoid having this issue for a very long time. Next up, timing chain guides. And as you just saw for the timing chain guides that came out of my engine, there was already some wear after just a couple years on the tensioning side timing chain guides. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and replace all of those. So I had already done that in the past, like I had said, I did that a couple years ago, but Thanks to FCP Euro, we're just going to go ahead and do our factory lifetime replacement, and we're going to replace those with brand new parts. Next item of business, connecting rod bearing failure. Now, we don't yet know the condition of the connecting rod bearings in my engine, but again, we're going to go ahead and just replace those with brand new connecting rod bearings. Also, we're going to go ahead and upgrade those with wider connecting rod bearings because, as I mentioned previously, the stock connecting rod bearings were a little bit thin, a little bit under spec. So if you go with wider ones, you have more surface area to take the load of the individual combustions, therefore better longevity. Next item, connecting rod bolt stretching. We're going with ARP bolts, guys. Basically, if you're not familiar with ARP, they make very strong hardware for engine internals. So ARP bolts will be extremely strong, they won't stretch on us, and we can just run them super hard and we'll have no problems. Next item, oil starvation. I did already put an FVD Brombacher oil sump, a deep sump in my car a couple years ago. There are deeper sumps you can get. I forget exactly how much capacity mine added, but it does come with a much better baffle and it has additional oil capacity. Like I said, I've done 2 track weekends with my car. I have not seen a single bit of evidence of oil starvation. If you want to buy a more expensive one for your car, go right ahead, but I believe the one that I have is good. We're going to continue running it. No further countermeasures required. And next, overheating under high loads on track. Well, we're going to apply the center radiator kit to my car as well so that we can just run for as long as we want out there and not have any level of overheating issues, especially with the re-sleeving that we're going to be doing on the engine, which may or may not result in a higher displacement. Little teaser. We'll talk about that more later. So with that, in the end, we're going to have a pretty awesome bulletproof beefed up M96 engine. And we'll talk even more details about specific brands that I'm going to use, specific considerations for parts that I decided to use, etc., in future videos. So stay tuned for that and subscribe if you want to get those updates when they come out. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it for today. In the next video, we're going to take the engine down even further. We're going to take the heads off. We're going to split the case halves. We're going to take apart the rotating assembly. It is all going to be completely taken apart by the end of the next video. So please like this video if you enjoyed this content and found it helpful and informative, or at the very least, just entertaining. Also, subscribe if you want to see what's yet to come for this project. A lot of exciting things ahead. I'm very excited, and I hope you are too. So thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Yes, you. I'm looking right at you. And I will see you all, hopefully, in the next video. Oh, hey, FunAhead friends and family. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see even more great FunAhead TV content, please click the suggested video right here. I'll see you over there.